A chill steals into the night. A girl curls up behind a dumpster, wrapped in a few crumpled newspapers. Her breath smokes thin and white. The toes of her shoes are split, taped together in a desperate lattice that speaks all the words she no longer has the strength to say. In a few minutes, the diner's neon will flicker on, and a server named Maria will step into the night shift as she always does. On time, silent, and staring straight ahead, as if the mere act of looking back would shatter her resolve. Inside, the door chime tinkles. A customer flicks a cup, coffee sloshing over the edge of the table. Coins ping against the tile. "Pick those up. That's all you're worth." Maria bends. No backtalk, no frantic apologies. Just bending. Her hands tremble. Part heat, part shame. From behind the counter, the manager's voice scrapes like dry paper. "Don't bring your family problems to work." The sentence drops like a lid, sealing in everything that needs to be heard. Someone is watching. A fresh apron, clumsy hands over a slick stack of soap-coated dishes. He introduces himself as Jake. So ordinary a name, no one looks twice. But his heart is pounding out of rhythm. For 12 years, he's signed off on reports about table efficiency, seat turnover, average tip rates. Not once has he stood this close to eyes trained to the floor. The moment hangs in the air like a question. How can a person work themselves to exhaustion and still sleep on scrap paper by night? If this is the price of productivity, what are we buying and what are we selling? Outside, wind scrapes a pockmarked wall. Maria tightens the frayed apron strings and moves quickly, careful enough that even her torn shoes seem afraid to make noise. She sweeps crumbs, tops off coffee, squares the crooked sugar packets. No factory smile, only the stubborn neatness of someone determined not to lose the last, small remnant of dignity. Jake stands at the sink, the smell of burnt grease and cleanser soaking into his skin. He sees more than a slipped tray or a scolding. He sees a system powered by silence, her silence as she bends, co-workers' silence as they look away, and the silence of spreadsheets that never blush. The first night begins like this. No shouting matches, just a chain of repeated motions until a person becomes a shadow. But within the monotony, the cracks appear. The taped-up shoes, the bag with rubbed raw seams, the way Maria keeps her back straight even as she stoops to pick up fallen coins. Each small detail, like italic letters in the margins, is writing an indictment of indifference. If you've ever found yourself caught between convenience and kindness, ask yourself three things. Right here at the opening of this story, am I rewarding rudeness simply because it's quicker? Do the policies I follow protect people or only my comfort? When someone bends to pick up spilled money, do I bend with them, if only with my eyes? Tonight, the answers don't need to be spoken. But from the instant Maria bowed and we looked up, the story began to move. At the sink, Jake pinches the edge of a wet plate. In his eyes and in ours, what needs to be seen is finally clear. Before we talk about profit, we have to relearn how to look at a human being. After the first night of watching, Jake, a borrowed name, stepped into the tiny back locker room. On the chair sat a navy suit jacket and a silk tie tucked neatly inside a leather bag. Familiar emblems of shareholder halls and Forbes lists. He stared at them for a long moment, folded them with care, and stowed them deep in the trunk of his car. In their place, a rough, worn apron, the strap biting into his collar, the smell of burnt grease clinging fast. For the first time in over a decade of owning a chain of diners, his hands plunged into a sink brimming with grease-caked plates. The soapy water was so hot it stung, reddening his knuckles. Each time a slick dish slipped and clanged, he froze, awkward as any rookie. From the line, Charlie, the night shift cook, cast a sidelong glance and lifted an eyebrow. "New guy? Not used to it, huh?" He forced a smile. "Yeah, first day. Still clumsy." Inside, every clatter landed like a confession. For years, he'd watched revenue per table, seat turn intervals, average ticket. Never once had he touched the work he'd been signing off on. Now soap bubbles burst. The sour reek of old yogurt rose from an unwashed cup. The pan hissed with fat, and all of it slapped him with a single truth. Those numbers were always bound to smells, to sweat, to living skin. Sweat gathered beneath the heavy apron. His shoulders ached. Yet beneath the fatigue came a strange quickening. He began to grasp the price Maria and her co-workers paid each day. Long hours didn't just drain the body. Without recognition, they eroded self-respect. Across the room, Maria flashed by with a tray stacked high with glasses. Hair hastily tied, uniform faded thin. Her small frame threaded the crowd without a spill, but her eyes kept darting to the clock as if racing an invisible enemy called unpaid overtime. Jake paused, one glove torn, watching her go. A thought flickered. If I had to live in those ripped shoes of hers, how long would I last? He knew then that his investigation was no longer a mere disguise. It was a confrontation with the denial he'd worn like a second skin. Tonight he wasn't a CEO in a busboy's costume. He was in truth an employee, relearning the value of a human being. For the audience, this marks a turn. Sometimes we each need to shed the executive jacket in our own lives. Titles, trophies, safe routines, and stand exactly where others are made to stand. Only when our hands touch the dirty dish and the scalding water do we truly understand the worth of a single act of empathy. Maria doesn't need long descriptions. One look is enough to tell her whole story. Her once bright uniform has dulled to gray, seams fraying at the cuffs. Her hair is pulled into a hurried ponytail, stray strands plastered with sweat. But it's her eyes that weigh the heaviest. Dark circles etched deep, eyelids sagging as if carrying the entire sky's fatigue. She moves constantly, like a clock hand that never stops. Refilling coffee, wiping crumbs, balancing trays stacked so high her wrists tremble, yet never daring to let go. Every motion is precise, as though her body has been drilled into a rhythm so repetitive it's become instinct. But her smile disappeared long ago. In its place remains only the faint dip of her head when a customer glances her way. Just enough to be polite, but stripped of warmth. Charlie, the night shift cook, mutters under his breath, 8 months straight, no days off. The words fall heavy, greasy, and linger in the suffocating air of the kitchen. At the sink, Jake, the reluctant dishwasher, watches silently. Each detail etches itself into his mind like a scar. The taped-up shoes, the stiff fingers carefully straightening sugar packets, the way her shoulders contract whenever the manager's voice cuts through the room. No HR report, no performance chart had ever told him this. A 19-year-old girl holding up her world with nothing but silence. Maria never complains, never asks for time off, never resists. She spins endlessly inside the machine, making others believe she can handle it. But the truth is, every step she takes shaves another slice off her youth. For the audience, she is no longer just a waitress. She embodies countless people around us. Tired eyes we glance past, trembling hands that still tidy tables neatly. And the question begins to sting. If productivity comes at the cost of a young woman's health and youth, is it truly an achievement? Maria keeps moving, as if time itself is not her enemy. But it is her silence, unyielding, uncomplaining, that rings louder than any cry. Sometimes, silence is the loudest alarm inside an organization. Some details are smaller than words, yet they lay bare the entire truth. For Maria, it was her shoes. The leather had split open at the toes, seams bursting like open wounds. The fabric lining curled outward, frayed and raw, as if clawed apart. Holding it all together were only a few strips of silver tape, hastily wound. Every step Maria took sounded like a sigh, a reminder that she was clinging to scraps of dignity with the cheapest of materials. A co-worker glanced down once and sneered, "What a walking museum piece." The words cut like a blade. Maria didn't reply. She forced a small smile, bowed her head, and carried on with her tray, as though her very existence were an apology. But that smile hurt more than tears. It wasn't joy, but a thin shield to cover humiliation. From the sink, Jake stood frozen. His eyes lingered on those shoes longer than anything else. In his mind rose a sharp contrast. The polished Italian leather he once buffed before board meetings, each pair costing more than Maria earned in a month. They had been his pride. Now they loomed like a shadow crushing his chest. Breath caught in his throat. Every step Maria took in her ruined shoes pressed against his ribcage. And he understood. These weren't just shoes. They were a silent flag, a signal that people had been forgotten, patching their survival together, yet still walking on with quiet resilience. Amid the clatter of dishes, one question echoed in Jake's mind. Who can truly live in shoes like these? The answer wasn't spoken but held in silence. Silence of those too proud to beg, too tired to fight, and too steadfast to stop. Those shoes did more than carry Maria. They carried a story of injustice, endurance, and the fragile dignity left intact. For the listener, that image becomes a symbol. If you want to understand someone's struggle, sometimes all you need to do is look down at their feet. Late at night, the diner grew quiet. The last checks were clipped. A few stray coins clinked into the glass jar by the counter. That tip jar, one of the few things that softened the grind of endless hours, aching legs and sleepless nights. Maria moved swiftly, clearing tables, but her eyes flicked toward the jar. Her fingers trembled as they touched the glass. She counted quickly, her motions practiced, precise like second nature. Then, suddenly, she split the money. Half was placed neatly back into the main jar. The other half slipped into a smaller jar, unmarked, hidden deep near the fold of her apron. The act was quick, almost invisible. Almost. But from the sink, Jake saw everything. He caught the dart of her eyes, the bow of her head, the way her hand closed tight around that smaller jar, as though it were treasure. What he saw wasn't theft. It was fear, old and familiar. Fear of being caught, fear of being blamed, but also determination, the will to keep aside something essential, something greater than herself. A question pulsed through Jake's mind. Was this stealing, or was it survival? He wanted to dismiss it, to believe the worst and walk away. But the image clung, her thin, shaking hand, her nervous glance, the tattered bag she clutched to her chest like it carried her very life. For the listener, this moment is not about petty theft. It reveals a bitter paradox. A girl working herself to exhaustion, still forced to squirrel away coins in secrecy, as though survival itself were a crime. That little jar, hidden in a worn-out bag, hangs in the air like a riddle. Is it evidence of greed, or a fragile ticket to preserve a dream? And in that uncertainty, we are pulled closer to Maria, reminded that not all silence means guilt. Sometimes silence is simply the only shield left to someone too powerless to survive any other way. The diner stayed bright through the night, forks and knives clattering, yet above the noise, humiliation cut through sharp and clear. A drunk customer, face flushed, flung his coffee cup. "This dishwater you call coffee?" He pulled a few coins from his pocket and hurled them to the floor. "There, pick it up. That's all you're worth." Maria froze, her lips pressed tight. Then slowly, she bent down and gathered each coin, her hands trembling. No protest, no words. Only the cold scrape of metal against her palm. The man's mocking laugh lingered until the door shut behind him. In the kitchen, Charlie pretended to focus on his pan, shoulders hunched, back stiff. At the sink, Jake gripped a plate so hard his knuckles whitened, but no one spoke. Silence had become the unspoken law. The next day, as Maria wiped down a table, she edged toward the manager, Derek, voice shaking. "Sir, tomorrow night, my sister has an important meeting. Could I switch my shift just this once?" Derek didn't even look up. "This is business, not charity. Family problems, leave them at the door." Maria bowed her head. "Yes, sir." Just 2 words, but they felt like a verdict. She backed away, smaller with each step, folding into herself as if to disappear. The audience may ask, why didn't anyone stand up? Why did everyone remain silent as one person was crushed? But that silence is the bitter truth. Fear of firing, fear of retaliation. These fears had sunk so deep that silence itself became the strongest chain. Jake watched, chest tight. The office slogans he had once approved, "We are family," suddenly felt obscene. Because at that moment, Maria's real family, her only sister, had just been brushed aside like trash. In the thick air, one reality crystallized. Toxic culture doesn't come from grand decrees, but from small, everyday moments. Mocking laughter, turned faces, compassion dismissed as weakness. Here, justice wasn't killed by a scream. It died slowly, strangled by collective silence. That night, as customers thinned out, Maria quietly opened the rickety wooden locker beside the kitchen. From her apron, she pulled a small notebook, its corners bent, cover worn. Her fingers trembled as she turned to a blank page. The pen scratched deep, each stroke carved like a wound. Night shift, Warshut 19, still not enough money. Ink bled across the paper, blurred by a falling tear. She wiped it quickly, but the stain spread wider. Maria snapped the notebook shut, shoved it into the locker, and locked it away as if hiding despair itself. No one was meant to know. No one was meant to see. But from the sink, Jake had caught a glimpse. Just a few words, yet sharp enough to twist into his chest like a blade. Before the weight of it could settle, another misfortune struck. A cup slipped, scalding coffee splattering onto Maria's wrist. She flinched, biting down hard to swallow the cry. Angry red welts blossomed across her skin. She stepped carefully to Derek, voice quivering. "Sir, may I have 5 minutes, just to cool my hand?" The manager didn't lift his eyes from the timesheet. "Table 6 is waiting. Serve first, then rest." Maria nodded faintly. "Yes, sir." Nothing more. She turned, one hand gripping the coffee tray, the other shaking violently. Pain scorched her with every step, but she kept moving. Jake stood frozen. His nails dug into his palm as fury rose in his throat. He remembered the boardroom speeches he'd once heard, praising the resilience of our staff. But this was no resilience. This was cruelty, disguised as discipline. Everyone saw. The busboy wiping tables, the cook flipping pancakes, even a few customers glancing nervously. But each one turned away. Every averted gaze was another lock fastening Maria's chains. She placed the coffee on table 6 with a thin, forced smile, even as her burns swelled raw and red. That smile, fragile and false, was the only thing holding her from breaking down right there. For the listener, this moment is no longer about Maria alone. It is a mirror reflecting any place where rules are twisted into shackles for the powerless, and where collective silence makes accomplices of us all. And in that instant, Jake, the CEO disguised as a dishwasher, knew. He was no longer just an observer. He had become a witness who could not look away. Late at night, after the diner's lights dimmed, Jake sat alone in the cramped office. In front of him lay a thin folder, its cover stamped with a name, Maria Velasquez. His fingers turned the pages, the desk lamp casting a yellow glow over words as cold as steel. A request form. "Please approve 2 extra shifts this month." Oh, the handwriting was neat, almost pleading. Beneath it, a red stamp shouted back, "Denied. Exceeds maximum hours." Jake swallowed hard. The next page stopped him cold. A handwritten note in the margin. Date of mother's death. Same day, same ink. On one sheet, a 19-year-old girl begged for overtime to cover hospital bills. On the next, a faceless rule erased her chance. He shut his eyes. In his mind, images rushed together. The taped-up shoes, the burn on her hand, the secret jar of coins, the trembling journal line. Still not enough. And stamped across them all, the word he had signed countless times, denied. In boardrooms, those denials had always felt like fair procedures to protect the company. But here, they were knives. Knives slicing into the flesh of a girl too young to carry such weight. Every sheet of paper was another hope extinguished. Every sterile phrase, violation, not eligible. Request denied was a door slammed on someone pleading for survival. Maria was not just one case. She was proof that the system itself punished the very people it claimed to regulate. What Jake had once seen as discipline now looked like cruelty written in ink. For the listener, this scene is no longer a private story. It reflects countless places where rigid rules, under the mask of fairness, crush the humanity they should protect. Under the dim glow of the office lamp, Maria's file became more than paperwork. It became an indictment. Jake's hands shook as he closed the folder. He knew the truth could never be folded away again. The papers lay still, but inside him, something irreversible had begun to stir. One evening, as the diner wound down and the last customers left, the tip jar on the counter still shimmered with a few crumpled bills. Maria was bent over gathering plates when from the corner of her eye she caught a familiar yet jarring sight. A co-worker, swift and practiced, slid a hand into the jar, pinched a bill, and tucked it smoothly into his pocket. No hesitation, no shame, as if it were routine. Maria froze mid-motion. For a split second, shock flickered in her eyes, then vanished as quickly as it came. She lowered her head further, resumed wiping the table. No protest, no confrontation, not even a glance to expose him. Only silence, heavy as lead. From the sink, Jake saw everything. He waited for her to speak, to at least flinch or frown, but nothing. She stayed silent. So silent that the silence itself was louder than a shout. His throat tightened. Why won't she say anything? Why let them take what little she has? To an outsider, such silence might seem like weakness, even complicity. But in Maria, it held more layers. It was fear. Fear of retaliation. It was resignation from someone too accustomed to loss. And it was a fragile belief that a few stolen dollars weren't worth risking the only job she had left. That small moment was a broken shard of glass reflecting the larger truth. When the exploited no longer defend even the scraps that belong to them, it is not because they don't care. It is because they've been taught survival is safer in silence. That night, Maria tied her worn-out bag and slipped away quickly, head bowed. Jake watched her retreat, his chest sinking with weight. He knew the silence was not emptiness. Behind it lay a reason, a secret not yet revealed. For the listener, this moment plants a piercing question. When someone chooses silence, even as their last possession is stolen, what greater burden are they protecting beyond themselves? One night, amid the din and the bitter smell of scorched coffee, the espresso machine sputtered and broke down. Steam hissed violently, dark smoke curling upward. Customers began murmuring with irritation. Derek, the manager, glanced at his watch, waved a dismissive hand. Leave it, not your job. But Maria didn't leave it. She set down her tray, pulled up a small stool, and leaned in. With quick, steady hands, she loosened the valve, scraped away the caked residue, tapped the filter clean, then reassembled the parts. In minutes, the machine exhaled a sharp hiss, then purred smoothly. Hot coffee streamed once again, the aroma drifting warmly through the diner. The tension eased. A few customers even nodded in approval, but Derek didn't. He smirked, voice flat. Stick to your own work. Don't cross the line. Maria stiffened. Then she lowered her head, turned back to the tables. On her arm still burned the scar from yesterday's scald, and on her lips flickered a smile so thin it seemed she was mocking herself. From the sink, Jake's heart pounded. The paradox lay bare before him. A girl who had just saved the shift, kept customers seated, restored the room's calm, was chastised, not thanked. He remembered the glossy brochures plastered across headquarters. We encourage initiative and creativity, words he had once been proud to sign. Now those slogans cut like a dull knife turned inward. On paper, innovation was praised. In reality, any spark was stamped out. For the listener, this scene is suffocating. When someone dares to do better, they are punished for stepping beyond the narrow frame imposed on them. Such a culture does not nurture growth. It strangles it. It doesn't build trust. It corrodes it. Maria passed by Jake, the scent of coffee clinging faintly to her apron. Yet her eyes were hollow, as if already resigned to being unseen. Jake clenched his fists, shame rising hot in his chest. Because those empty slogans, the very lies now crushing her, had once carried his signature. And so a question hangs heavy in the air. If a system praises initiative in the boardroom, but punishes it on the floor, what is it truly cultivating? Progress or blind obedience? During a short lull, when the diner finally quieted, Maria slipped a small foil packet from her worn-out bag. She opened it quickly, discreetly. Inside was nothing more than a hardened scrap of yesterday's bread, edges stale and crumbling. She broke it into tiny pieces, slipping them into her mouth with hurried bites, as though afraid someone might see. No water, no side dish, just enough to keep her body from collapsing. Her eyes darted around nervously, as if eating was a crime that needed hiding. From the sink, Jake froze. He had seen waitresses carry plates heavy with steak, cakes crowned with cream, glasses of milk foaming to the brim. Yet Maria, the one who served them all, survived on a crust of dry bread, devoured in secret like contraband. His throat tightened. Hunger, he realized, wasn't only an empty stomach. It was humiliation so deep that even eating became something to conceal. When she carefully folded the foil again, smoothing its wrinkles before tucking it back into her bag, Jake recognized the pattern. Saving even scraps of paper, eating quickly, avoiding all eyes. It was evidence not just of poverty, but of a life worn thinner than anyone around her could guess. Later, in a brief exchange with Charlie, Jake overheard another shard of truth. Maria's mother had died of cancer, leaving behind only a younger sister. No one knew where Maria went after shifts, what home she returned to, if any. Only silence, sighs, and uncertain shrugs. The pieces began to fit together. Taped shoes, hidden tip jar, the journal of debts, the stale bread. This was more than hardship. It was survival without a roof. Jake gripped the edge of a dishcloth, his hand trembling. For the first time, dread gnawed at him, not of discovery, but of the truth itself, that her life was far harsher than he dared imagine. For the listener, Maria's secret meal of bread crusts cuts deeper than hunger. It forces the conscience to ask, if someone can work tirelessly and still have to hide a mouthful of stale food, where has fairness gone? The next day, Maria stepped into the manager's office, clutching a folded sheet of paper. Her voice quivered, low but pleading. Please, could I have a small advance on my wages? I promise I'll pay it back next month. Derek glanced up for barely a second before returning to his printer. A sharp click echoed. The paper came back into her hands, stamped with stark letters. Request denied. Employment less than 6 months. That was it. No explanation. No empathy. Just ink on paper deciding her fate. Maria's eyes lingered on the stamp. Her hand crumpled the page until it was wrinkled beyond use. Only 2 faint words slipped out, almost whispered to herself. I understand. Then she bowed her head and walked out. Her small frame trembled, not from the chill of the air conditioner, but from the coldness of a system without a pulse. Night fell, and the shift ended. Staff trickled into their cars, headlights cutting through the dark. Maria was the last to leave. She didn't walk toward any vehicle. Instead, she hugged her frayed bag tighter. Jake followed quietly, keeping distance. She passed the rows of parked cars, not stopping at the beat-up Honda that had sat there for weeks. Her path veered into the alley behind the diner. There, among dumpsters and damp brick walls, Maria curled up, wrapping herself in sheets of old newspaper. She held her bag close, as if everything she owned was inside. Her breath hung pale in the freezing air. Jake froze. His hand covered his mouth, but he couldn't stifle the sharp gasp. Doubt was gone. The truth lay bare. Maria had no home. The waitress who worked herself raw, denied even a small advance, was sleeping on scraps of paper behind the restaurant she served. Shaking, he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo. Not for a report, not for proof to anyone else, but to carve the image into his heart. Maria huddled in torn shoes, pressed against her chest, a living indictment that no spreadsheet had ever shown. A question pounded in his chest, heavy as lead. How many other Marias have we ignored, invisible in the cracks of our own company? For the listener, this scene needs no commentary. The truth speaks for itself. Poverty had escaped the numbers. It was written now on flesh and bone. Jake sat in his car, hands locked tight on the steering wheel. The image of Maria curled beneath the street lamp replayed again and again against the windshield of his mind, like a film reel stuck on the most unbearable frame. He let his forehead fall onto the wheel, chest clenched. Then suddenly his fist slammed down, blaring the horn in one long, desperate cry. The sound pierced the night, then cut off, leaving only suffocating silence. Out of that silence, his voice cracked, raw and hoarse. 12 years. 12 years. And I only looked at numbers. He said it again, louder, the words shattering in his throat. 12 years calling myself a leader, while my people sleep under trash paper. The pale glow of his phone screen lit his haggard face. A tear slipped, hastily wiped, only to be replaced by another. This wasn't the pressure of shareholders or quarterly losses. This was shame, stripped bare, inescapable. Images collided in his mind. The gleam of polished Italian shoes, graphs climbing in glossy reports, the thunder of applause in boardrooms. And then, taped up sneakers, a secret jar of coins, blistered hands serving coffee, a girl curled behind a dumpster. The clash tore through the pride he had built like glass breaking under a hammer. His voice fell into a whisper, almost a plea to himself. How many other Marias have I made? How many are breaking under the rules I signed? There was no answer, only the weight of his own breath, ragged and uneven. That night, Jake was no longer a CEO. He was just a man, sitting in the dark, staring into the moral collapse of everything he thought he had built. For the listener, this is the fracture point, the moment when leadership is no longer about balance sheets, but about conscience. Sometimes it takes being crushed by truth to begin the long climb toward change. The next day, Maria stood once more before the manager's desk, a request form trembling in her hands. Her voice was gentle, almost pleading. "Mr. Derek, please, could I take on an extra shift? I really need the hours." The reply came swift and sharp, like a blade. "You've already hit 38 hours this week. Policy doesn't allow more. End of discussion." A stamp hit the paper. One number, 38, rose like a wall too high to climb. It didn't care about rent. It didn't care about tuition. It didn't care that her shoes were splitting apart. It only cared about the illusion of fairness that in practice was crushing her. Maria lowered her head, whispering, "Yes, sir." She withdrew quietly, shoulders quivering, but arms clutched tight around her worn bag, as though hiding the weakness spilling out of her. That evening, Jake followed her at a distance. He saw Maria pause at a convenience store glowing under harsh fluorescent light. She walked straight to the noodle aisle. Her eyes skimmed the shelves, passing flavors she couldn't afford, stopping at the very bottom, where the cheapest packets lay. She picked one up, hesitated, then put it back and chose an even cheaper brand. At the register, she pulled coins slowly from her pocket, laying them down one by one, each drop echoing the weight of sacrifice. The cashier's gaze softened, but Maria only offered a faint smile and bowed her head, apologizing with her silence for buying so little. Outside, the cold wind bit hard. Maria hugged the noodle packet to her chest as if it were treasure. Jake stood by the glass storefront, his chest caving. He had signed million-dollar contracts, spent more on a single dinner than Maria earned in weeks. And now he saw the raw truth. After nearly 40 hours of labor, one of his own workers was left with nothing more than the cheapest packet of noodles for dinner. His voice cracked into the night, barely more than a whisper. This is her meal after everything she's given." For the listener, this scene is devastating. 40 hours of work traded for a belly of instant noodles. That is not balance. That is not fairness. It is an insult to dignity. Late at night, Jake followed Maria's steps to a rundown building, its walls cracked, its wooden door peeling. She climbed the narrow staircase, her footsteps so light the floorboards groaned louder than she did. She knocked gently, 3 times. The door opened to reveal a young girl about 12, her hair tied with a faded ribbon. Her face lit up instantly. "Maria!" she cried, throwing herself into her sister's arms. Maria set down her tattered bag and pulled out 2 things. The instant noodles she had just bought in a secondhand school book, its spine broken, but its pages still clean. She placed the noodles on a rickety table, then handed the book to the girl as though it were treasure. The girl, Camila, clutched the book to her chest, eyes shining. The joy was pure, but the room could not hide its poverty. Walls blotched and peeling, wallpaper stained, a crooked table leaning dangerously, a dim bulb flickering above. On the wall, carefully taped in place, hung a piece of paper, an admission letter from a school. The bold words, "Admission confirmed," stamped with an official seal. From outside the cracked window, Jake watched silently. His heart sank. He understood now. Every coin, every hour, every bruise Maria endured wasn't just for survival. It was for Camila, for the chance to keep her in school, for the dream their mother had left behind. Inside, Maria stroked her sister's hair and whispered, "Don't worry about me, Camila. I can handle it. What matters is you study hard. I promised Mom, and I will never let that promise break." Camila gripped her sister's hand. tears welling, but her smile bright. In that shabby room, the two of them clung to each other. One packet of noodles, one old book, and a fragile dream pinned to the wall. Jake turned away, drawing a deep, ragged breath, eyes blurred. At last, the truth pierced him. Maria wasn't working herself to the bone just to exist. She was carrying an entire future on her shoulders. For the listener, this moment cuts deep. Every sacrifice, every silence, every humiliation Maria bore was rooted in unconditional love for her sister. And it forces the question, can a promise made by a 19-year-old girl to her dying mother withstand a world intent on breaking it? Late at night, the small room glowed under the flicker of a weak bulb. Maria placed a glass jar on the wobbly wooden table. Inside, coins clinked against each other, mixed with a few crumpled bills. She poured everything out, the metallic sound hitting the silence like heavy rain. Her thin fingers arranged the coins into neat stacks, whispering numbers under her breath. Beside her, Camilla sat still, wide-eyed, as though afraid to interrupt the ritual. At last, Maria scribbled the final sum on a wrinkled scrap of paper. The pen stopped. Her hand froze. On the page, written in shaky letters, still short, 8,000. 2 words, 1 number. Yet together they felt like a sentence. Maria's shoulders quivered. She pressed both hands over the paper as if she could crush the truth out of existence. But the number remained, cold and immovable. Camilla's small voice broke the silence. "Do we have enough, Maria?" Maria lifted her head and forced a fragile smile, though her eyes shimmered. "We will, I promise. I made a promise to Mom." She pulled her sister into her arms, holding on tightly, as if her embrace were the last fortress left standing. Camilla buried her face against her, trying not to cry, but her trembling hands clung to Maria's sleeve. Outside the cracked window, Jake stood motionless. The sight carved into him, a dying mother's promise, a dream of education, and a gulf of $8,000, towering like a mountain impossible to cross. This was no longer about long shifts or a weary waitress. It was about love and sacrifice, suffocating under numbers with no soul. For the listener, this moment is suffocating. Every coin in that jar is more than money. It is sleepless hours, skipped meals, burns swallowed in silence. And yet it still wasn't enough. The question lingers, sharp and unrelenting. Can a 19-year-old girl's promise to her mother withstand a ruthless system and the immensity of an $8,000 debt? That morning, in the office lit by harsh fluorescent light and thick with the smell of paper, Jake pulled up the company's HR system. Page after page of forms scrolled across the screen, each stamped with the same merciless words: request denied, not eligible, exceeds 38 hours. The lines repeated like blows from a hammer. For years, Jake had seen them as routine, fair, neutral safeguards for the company. But now each phrase felt like a verdict against Maria, echoing in his mind as vividly as the taped shoes, the secret jar of tips, the burn on her hand, the coins spilled across a diner floor. Every denied was another time she'd been pushed down. That evening, Maria returned to the crumbling room she called home. In her hands was a thin envelope. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet, words stark and merciless. Payment due, 11 days. Her vision blurred. 11 days. Not 2 weeks, not even enough time to breathe. 11 days to gather an impossible sum. Her hand clutched the paper so tightly it crumpled. She folded it fast, shoving it deep into her bag as though hiding it could erase the truth. But the fear remained, pulsing in her chest, heavy as stone. From a distance, Jake saw her shoulders collapse under the weight of those words. He understood then. She wasn't just working against exhaustion. She was racing against a clock that cared nothing for her. For the listener, this is no longer simply Maria's story. It is a warning of how policies can turn into walls, cold, unyielding, crushing the very people they are meant to manage. And now the countdown had begun. 11 days. No more, no less. 11 days to keep a mother's promise alive, or watch it shatter beneath the weight of a deadline. The question hangs in silence. Who will break that wall before it buries her completely? That night, with the diner nearly empty and the yellow kitchen light casting long shadows, Jake stepped forward, hands still wet from the sink, but his chest burning. He stopped before Derek, the manager. his voice low yet edged with steel. "You've seen it, haven't you? Maria is drowning. Why haven't you helped her?" Derek leaned back against the counter, arms folded, lips curling into a thin, cold smile. "Help her? She's the perfect night shift worker. Doesn't complain, doesn't cause trouble. If you want smooth operations, you leave it alone. People like her, the more desperate they are, the easier they are to control." Jake froze. The answer wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. Maria wasn't overlooked. She was kept exactly where she was because suffering made her obedient. "She's homeless, Derek. You know that, don't you?" Jake pressed, voice trembling with anger. Derek shrugged, eyes flat, indifferent. "Not my problem. She clocks in, she does her job. That's all that matters. Where she sleeps, what she eats, that's on her." A chill ran down Jake's spine. The silence of the system wasn't blind. It was deliberate. It wasn't that management didn't see. It was that they chose not to care, because neglect kept the powerless in line. For the first time, Jake looked Derek in the eye without hiding his fury. The words thundered inside his chest. "We've turned a human being's suffering into a business tool." For the listener, this is the revelation at the rotten core of exploitation. Injustice doesn't thrive by accident. It is cultivated, maintained, because it benefits those in control. A culture that weaponizes silence is not incompetence. It is cruelty, systemized. Jake clenched his fists. He knew then, this was no longer about Maria alone. It was an indictment of the very machine he had built, one that allowed men like Derek to smile through their apathy. And in that confrontation, the truth stood naked. Reform was no longer optional. It was a duty. That night, in the dim light of a flickering bulb, Maria sat curled on her narrow cot. On her lap lay the battered notebook, its pages already stained with smudged ink and tears. Her hand shook as she pressed the pen down, the words spilling out in frantic strokes. "Rent unpaid, shoes torn, 11 days left. If I lose this job tomorrow, then tomorrow is also the end." The pen slipped from her grasp, clattering softly to the floor. The sound was small, but in the silence it struck like a funeral bell. Maria buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with muffled sobs. The cries were quiet, too quiet for anyone outside to hear, but sharp enough to cut through the soul of anyone who witnessed. At the doorway, Jake stood frozen, unseen. He no longer felt like a man in disguise, but like an intruder in someone else's breaking heart. Every number, every denial, every policy he had once signed had transformed into these desperate sentences, carved in ink and sorrow. This was no financial ledger. It was a record of survival on the brink of collapse. Maria's voice cracked, barely a whisper, as if confessing to the darkness itself. "I can't let Camilla fall. But if they take this job tomorrow, then tomorrow is the end for both of us." For the listener, this moment cuts to the bone. A 19-year-old girl, instead of writing dreams, is forced to write the last lines of her endurance. It is a journal not of hope, but of despair, one step away from surrender. Jake gripped the doorway, his eyes burning. Never before had he seen so vividly how an entire system's cold indifference could press itself into the fragile lines of a young woman's notebook. It was undeniable, unforgivable, and a haunting question lingered in the air. If no one stops this spiral, will Maria even rise to face the morning? The intercom crackled suddenly, its tone cold and sharp. "All staff, report to the meeting room immediately." The words cut through clinking silverware and chatter, freezing everyone mid-motion. Eyes darted in confusion. Maria clutched the tray in her hands, her heart thudding wildly. Only one thought gripped her. "They're going to fire me." Her fingers brushed against her worn-out bag. Inside, the little glass jar rattled faintly, coins trembling like a heartbeat. If this job vanished, the jar meant nothing, and with it, Camilla's dream would collapse. One by one, the employees filed into the cramped back room. The air was heavy, every gaze fixed on the floor, waiting for whatever storm was about to break. Derek stood at the front, face stern, but a smug shadow lingered at the corners of his mouth. He cleared his throat, ready to speak. Before he could utter a word, a figure stepped forward from the back. The man untied his grease-stained apron, straightened his stance, and spoke with a voice that carried steady authority. "My name is not Jake Morrison. My name is Jacob Bradford." The room erupted in gas. Murmurs rippled like a wave. Someone dropped a glass, shattering it across the tiles. All eyes snapped to him. Maria froze. The name struck her like thunder. Jacob Bradford. The name stamped on every paycheck, printed on every corporate memo, etched onto the slogans that lined the walls. The man she thought would never set foot here was standing before her, not in a suit, but in the simple clothes of a dishwasher. His gaze was unwavering, heavy with truth. Derek's face drained of color. The clumsy busboy he had mocked, the one he dismissed daily, was the CEO himself. The room held its breath. Jacob laid a stack of papers on the table. Pages scattered, forms stamped denied, schedules of rejected requests, and on top, a single photograph. Maria curled against the wall outside, wrapped in newspaper scraps. His voice rang out, firm and unflinching. "This is one of your own employees. This is the price our company has forced her to pay." For the listener, this is the earthquake moment. The mask stripped away, the game over. No longer CEO versus waitress, only raw truth laid bare for all to see. Maria clutched her bag to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. She did not know if this revelation meant punishment, salvation, or both. But she knew one thing for certain: she was invisible no longer. The meeting room was silent, the only sound the relentless tick of the clock on the wall. Papers stamped "denied" lay scattered across the table like open wounds, and at the top, one photograph remained. Maria, curled up outside with newspapers wrapped around her like a blanket. Jacob lifted his gaze, sweeping the room. His voice broke the silence, deliberate and heavy. "You all saw these forms. You all stamped these denials. You all looked away, and so did I. But today, there is no place left to hide." His palm slammed down on the stack of papers. The sharp crack made the entire room flinch. Every stamp here represents dignity stripped from a human being. And this, he held up Maria's photo, is the cost. A young woman, working herself to exhaustion, sleeping under trash paper just to survive. A sob slipped from the corner of the room. A supervisor covered her mouth with her hand, eyes brimming. Others hung their heads, shame burning in the silence. Jacob turned toward Maria, his voice lowering, steady but resonant. "Maria, you will not be fired. You will no longer be silenced. Your story marks a line in the sand. From this day forward, no one in this company will ever endure what you have." Maria pressed her bag against her chest, tears streaming, not of humiliation this time, but of a fragile hope she hadn't felt in years. Jacob drew a deep breath and declared, his tone like iron, "As of this moment, these policies end. As of this moment, this company changes. From now on, we will measure not just by numbers, but by the worth of every human being who carries those numbers on their back." At first, there was only stillness, then a ripple, tentative applause. It grew, swelled, until it thundered through the room, drowning out the sound of weeping and replacing it with something stronger. Release. For the listener, this is the turning point. Silence shattered by confession, despair pierced by the possibility of justice. But Jacob knew the truth. Words were only the beginning. What mattered now was action. Proof that the promises spoken here would be carved into reality. Healing the wounds Maria had been forced to carry alone. In the cramped meeting room, after Jacob's fiery words, the air turned sharp with expectation. All eyes shifted as Jacob fixed his gaze squarely on Derek. No shields left, no excuses to hide behind. His voice cut low but firm. "Derek, do you remember what you said? Not my problem." The words dropped like a hammer. Derek's face drained, lips parting as though to object, but no sound escaped. Jacob stepped closer, each word measured, heavy as stone. "You sneered when Maria begged for one shift change to care for her sister. You dismissed her burn when she asked for 5 minutes to cool her skin. You saw her struggle and twisted it into leverage to keep her silent. That is not management. That is cruelty, disguised as control." Derek's eyes darted across the room, searching desperately for support, but he found none. Every face stared back, heavy with shame, some with tears. Even Charlie, the night cook, gripped his ladle with trembling hands, his eyes wet but unflinching. Then from the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. Soon the room filled with applause, not for Derek, but for the truth finally spoken aloud. The sound swelled, drowning out whatever excuse Derek might have tried to muster. He bowed his head, shoulders quaking, the weight of his own downfall pressing him into silence. Jacob raised a hand, and the room quieted. His next words were sharp, decisive. Effective immediately, Derek is relieved of his position. This company has no room for calculated indifference, masquerading as leadership. A collective exhale swept through the staff. For the first time, eyes turned toward Maria, not with pity, but with respect. Jacob's voice softened, yet carried strength. Justice isn't an abstract principle. It must live in every shift, in every paycheck, in every pair of shoes that no longer needs tape to hold together. And starting today, justice is the standard here. Maria stood still, tears streaming, but this time they were tears of release. She would no longer have to stoop to the floor for coins flung at her feet, no longer hide a jar of tips like a criminal. For the listener, this moment marks the great reversal. The oppressor stripped of power, the silenced given back their voice. Justice ceased to be a slogan. It became action, alive in that room. 2 months later, the company's main hall gleamed under bright lights. Every seat was filled. Employees, guests, even those who once bowed their heads in silence now sat upright, their eyes fixed on the stage. Behind the podium, bold letters stretched across the backdrop. The Maria Velasquez Scholarship Fund launch ceremony. In the front row, Maria sat quietly, her old torn bag replaced by a simple, sturdy one. Yet her hands trembled as she clutched it, her heart unable to believe her name now carried such weight. The same name once tied to poverty and silence was now a symbol of hope. Jacob stepped onto the stage, not in a polished suit, but in a plain shirt. His voice, calm but resolute, carried through the hall. We once allowed a 19-year-old girl to shoulder the weight of the world, to sleep under rain-soaked newspapers, to eat scraps of bread just so her sister could dream of school. That was our greatest failure. But from that failure today, we plant the seeds of something new. He paused, his eyes meeting Maria's before sweeping across the room. From this day forward, the Maria Velasquez Scholarship Fund will ensure that no dream of education is buried by poverty. This is not just a fund, it is a vow that we will never again abandon those who trust us with their labor and their lives. The hall erupted into thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, the sound swelling like a collective pledge. Then a name was called, Camila Velasquez. The young girl stepped onto the stage, her hands gripping the scholarship certificate tightly. Her eyes shimmered under the lights, reflecting not just pride, but possibility. Maria sat below, her hands pressed together, tears streaming freely. This time not from despair, but from a pride so deep it hurt. For the listener, this moment is transformation incarnate. What began as a desperate note, still short 8,000, had blossomed into a legacy carrying Maria's name. From a story of silence and suffering rose a movement of dignity and hope, reaching far beyond two sisters. Here the lesson carves itself into memory. From the darkest failures, we can forge the brightest futures, if we dare to change. The hall fell silent as Maria stepped onto the stage. The microphone trembled faintly in her hand, but her eyes shone brighter than they ever had. She drew in a deep breath and began, her voice fragile yet carrying through every corner of the room. I once slept behind a dumpster, wrapped in newspapers soaked with rain. I once hid stale bread in my pocket and ate it quickly, like a crime. I once begged for an extra shift, only to be handed a red stamp that said, "Denied." She paused, her throat tightening, but she held her gaze steady, meeting the eyes of those before her. But I did not break. Every coin I picked up, every burn I endured, every tear I swallowed, it was for someone, for my sister Camilla, and for a promise I made to my mother. I will never let her dream vanish. A ripple of muffled sobs spread through the audience. Some staff covered their faces with their hands, unable to hide their grief. Maria's voice grew firmer, steadier. There were days I thought silence would protect me, but silence does not save anyone. True change begins when we speak, when we rise, when we believe that fairness must exist. She placed her hand over her heart. This scholarship does not carry my name because I am more deserving than anyone else. It carries my name to remind us that anyone can be pushed into the shadows, but if just one hand reaches out, they can find their way back to the light. Today, I stand here not only for myself, but for everyone who has ever lived in silence and darkness as I once did. The hall erupted with applause, loud, unrelenting, and filled with tears. Maria was no longer the girl who bent to pick coins off the floor, no longer the worker hiding her hunger behind a weary smile. She had become a voice, proof that even from the deepest despair, a spark can rise to ignite hope. For the listener, this is the peak of transformation, Maria's rebirth. From voicelessness to testimony, from despair to beacon, her words echo a truth for all. No matter how dark the night, a single flame can still light the room. Months after the ceremony, the diner that once carried the weight of silence had taken on a new face. The walls, once cracked and dulled, now gleamed with fresh paint. The bulletin board no longer displayed hollow slogans about efficiency, but carried bold, simple truths. People first, profit second. Respect is the foundation. Charlie, the night cook, walked straighter now, no longer shrinking under invisible burdens. Young servers shared stories about classes they were taking, new training programs the company now funded. Paychecks had risen by 20%. Not just numbers, but a recognition of dignity. Behind the counter, Maria wore a crisp new apron. She no longer moved like a shadow. She guided new staff, teaching them how to brew coffee properly, how to greet customers with warmth. Her smile was no longer forced. It was quiet, genuine, alive. At a small table near the corner, Camilla bent over her books beneath a warm lamp. The framed acceptance letter still hung on the wall, but now it was joined by another plaque. The Maria Velasquez Scholarship Fund, no one left behind. Jacob often visited the diner, not as a distant CEO, but as a quiet presence. He stood in the background, watching the laughter of the staff, the steady rhythm of work no longer poisoned by fear. His eyes softened, not with guilt anymore, but with the weight of a promise kept. For the listener, this ending is not simply resolution, it is rebirth. The diner, once a symbol of exploitation, now breathes as a testament to transformation. From silence and suffering rose a culture grounded in fairness. The truth etched into its walls is simple but powerful. Justice before revenue, people before numbers. And in the hum of voices, the sparkle in Camilla's eyes and the serenity in Maria's smile, one understands. This is not an ending, but the beginning of a legacy. Proof that change is possible and that dignity, once restored, can light the way for generations to come.